Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon. Now, anybody that knows me knows that I'm pretty much obsessed with The Shining, and here we're talking mostly about the 1980s Stanley Kubrick film adaptation. I've seen it probably about 100 times, and I love like reading about theories about it and like getting really deep dive into all this like symbolism, even if a lot of times I think maybe some people are like reaching and shit like that, but it's just like fun, and it's a movie that I absolutely never get tired of, easily in my top 5 horror movies of all time. I know that there's kind of been a lot of videos about The Shining, and there's been a lot of videos about particularly how Stephen King wasn't a big fan of Stanley Kubrick's adaptation, so I don't really want to tread that ground again because I feel like that's been done a lot. So what I wanted to do on this video, I didn't so much want to compare the Stanley Kubrick film version with the book. I will talk about the book a little bit on this one, just, for comparison's sake and stuff. But what I wanted to focus on mostly in this one was how the Stanley Kubrick version compared with the 1997 made-for-TV version. And that one, the teleplay was written by Stephen King and it was directed by Mick Garris. I'm gonna say that, so probably like maybe the theme of this video, like I know I called it Shining versus Shining, so I'm like comparing the two, which I am, but I think a more apt kind of description of what I'm going to be talking about is why I think the Stanley Kubrick version is better than the TV version, even though obviously the Stanley Kubrick version is a lot different from the book. So that's kind of what we're going to be discussing on this video, so let's get started. Now let me take a minute just to talk about Stephen King, like as a writer in general. I am a big fan of his. I've read a great deal of his books, especially pretty much like all his older ones I've read. I admit that I haven't kept up with his sort of like voluminous output. I mean, come on, I do have other things to do and like other books I have to read too. It's like he puts out so many that it's just kind of like I can't really keep up. I think the most recent book of his that I read was Revival, which came out in 2014. And I actually found that in a secondhand bookstore, and I'm like, what the fuck is this? I didn't even know he wrote this book. And I ended up really, really digging that one. I thought that was like really, really cool. It kind of reminded me of Something Wicked This Way Comes kind of vibe. And I was like, man, this is really good. They should make this into a movie. Before that, I think the most recent ones I read were Under the Dome, which was from 2009, which was okay, but I don't really remember that much about it, and Dr. Sleep from 2013. I wasn't a huge fan of the book, although I did like the Mike Flanagan film that was made out of it. I actually think I liked the film a little bit better than the book. The book was fine. It was just, I don't know, it didn't really like grab me all that much. Now, most people, I feel like there's not really a lot of argument in the fact that his older work is a lot more iconic and a lot more memorable than his newer stuff. I mean, he writes so much that I kind of feel like, any writer is going to have, pet themes that they come back to and stuff like that. And as I said, I can't really judge too much because, it's 2022 and the most recent book of his that I read came out in 2014, so I haven't read anything of his like new since then. So it's possible that he might have written some like amazing thing like after that and I haven't read it. But I do think, and I don't think I'm the only person that thinks this, that a lot of his older stuff, I mean, is still being read and still being talked about, maybe more so than his new stuff, which, like I said, that's not crazy. That happens to a lot of writers, like when they get older and stuff like that. Even if they put out as many books as he does, which is a fucking lot, then, their older work is always going to be, like, more remembered because, you remember it more from, like, back then. Like, decades later, people are still talking about all of his older books. Now, the book, The Shining, is one of his best books, I think. It might be my favorite. I'm not entirely sure. I think maybe Pet Sematary is my favorite, but it's kind of hard to say. He wrote, like, a lot of really good ones, but The Shining is definitely up there. I think it's, like, a fantastic read. I just reread it, like, probably, like, a year or two ago, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's definitely one of his best books, particularly from his early era. And honestly, like the first time I read it, it scared the fucking crap out of me. So, it really did make an impression. So I'm saying that Stephen King, he writes so much that some of his stuff's obviously going to be hits and some of it's going to be misses. But when it's a hit, it's a really, really big hit. You know what I mean? Like, he's really, really good. There's something that I always found kind of weird about him, though. One of my favorite books of his is his nonfiction book, Danse Macabre, which came out like in the early 1980s. And if you haven't read it, it's amazing. He's talking about horror he talks about literature and movies and TV and stuff like that. And it's only like recent up to 1980 because, that's shortly before like the book came out. But it's very astute, and I really, really do like the insight that he has into horror, like what works and what doesn't. And the thing about it, though, is that he has a very good idea, and he really, like, conveys it pretty clearly in his book, that he believes that ambiguity is generally good for horror, that it's kind of like necessary if you really want like something to be like effectively scary. What's unknown is always gonna be like scarier than what's known. What's unexplained is much scarier than what's explained. That's not, that's obviously not original to Stephen King. I think even H.P. Lovecraft said some stuff like that too. Everybody knows that horror works better when you're not quite sure, when you can't quite see the monster, you don't quite know what's going on. Like I said, there are exceptions to the rule, but in general, the more you explain something, the more you become familiar with it, the less scary it is. So the fact that Stephen King seems to know this and seems to believe this and seems to point out, in Danse Macabre, examples of movies and books and stuff like that he thinks works for that exact reason, because they're ambiguous or they leave things unexplained. When he's like involved in a film project, I feel like he never takes that advice. You know what I mean? Like, it seems like he understands it in theory, but then when they give him the reins of like a film project, or he gets involved in a film project, in practice, it never seems to work out like that. The thing about it, and particularly in relation to books versus their movie adaptations, in a book, you can get away with, like, for example, big chunks of exposition, this real meticulous description of detail and things like that, because you don't have the luxury of visuals. You're trying to like build a world inside your reader's head, so you can get away with a lot of things that if you put it into a movie would obviously be really boring or really redundant or something like that. It's two completely different mediums, and the same things generally don't work in both. In a movie, everything's paraded right in front of your eyes, right? And that usually means, particularly in horror, that you kind of have to know when to exercise some measure of restraint, either whether it's over what you show or what you keep hidden. And this seems to be, at least in all the films that Stephen King was directly involved in, he doesn't really seem to be able to do that. I mean, look at Maximum Overdrive, for Christ's sake, which I'm not shitting on that movie because it's really fun, but it's fun in the way pro wrestling is fun. It's like big and loud and kind of stupid, but it's kind of like entertaining in spite of itself. And yes, I know like Stephen King was like all coked up and everything like that when he made that movie, but he was all coked up when he wrote the books too. So, and the books are still good. I mean, that was just kind of like a big, loud, obnoxious movie. So consequently not scary at all. Entertaining, funny, but not really all that scary. And the thing about it too is that even movies that he wasn't directly involved in, adaptations of his work that he claimed that he really liked, would be like Children of the Corn from the 80s or The Mangler, which aren't really that great of films. I mean, I do like those movies, but they're not classics. They're not, and the thing about it is like I guess he likes them for the same reason, because they're kind of big, loud, and stupid. And maybe he likes that in movies, and that's, no shame. I kind of like that too sometimes. But I kind of feel like, I don't know, like when he's making a movie, I kind of feel like if you want it to be scary, if you want, like, because the story, The Mangler, the story, Children of the Corn, there's scary stories. Like, if you wanted to make a scary movie out of that, you can't make it this, like, kind of dumb, big, loud, obnoxious kind of movie. It just, like, doesn't work the same. Now that I've said all that, let's talk about the 1997 adaptation of The Shining, which was made for TV. As I said, Stephen King wrote the teleplay, Mick Garris directed it. Now, I love Mick Garris. I've seen him on tons of horror documentaries, and he seems like a super nice dude. He's very, very knowledgeable about horror. He's directed a lot of Stephen King adaptations, but for whatever reason, something about his directorial style just doesn't like jibe with me, and I can't really like put my finger on what it is. Like, I will forever love him for coming up with the idea, like being sort of like the producer, creator, whatever, of the Masters of Horror series. That said, the 2 or 3 like episodes of that he directed were like my least favorite ones. I can't even remember like a movie of his that I really, really liked. You know what I mean? Like some of them were like okay, but that was as much. And like I said, he seems like a nice man. It's just something about the way he directs films like doesn't really draw me in, I guess, and I can't really like put my finger on what it is. When the 1997 adaptation of The Shining came to TV, I remember actually watching it at the time, and I was kind of like, well, I was a big fan of the book. I was a big fan of the Stanley Kubrick version, and I was like, well, I feel like I need to watch this, even though it will probably suck. Like, I went into it with a lot of trepidation because I said, I know how Stephen King does, like, when he's given the reins of a movie project, and this is probably, he's probably going to whiff it. So I started watching the miniseries. I can't remember like how many nights it was over. I think it ends up being like about 6 hours long. When I watched it, I remember at the time in the late 1990s that I hated it so much that I just didn't even bother finish watching. I was like, well, that was even like more atrocious than I was expecting. So, you know what I mean? So I was like, fuck that. I'm not like watching anymore. So then fast forward many, many years. Me and my boyfriend Tom were talking about The Shining because we'd been listening to some radio show about Stanley Kubrick's use of symbolism. Now, I happened to mention to him, it's like, man, did you see that like stinker of a 1997 adaptation that Stephen King wrote that they made for TV? I was like, man, that sucked out loud. It's like, to me, I said, it seemed like he just made it because he didn't like the Kubrick version. So it seemed like kind of bitchy, you know what I mean? Like, and he was mad that people were still like talking about the Kubrick version as like one of the best horror movies ever. And he's like, I'll show you guys. I'm going to make my own adaptation of the book. And so maybe that he wasn't thinking that, but that's kind of how it came across to me. So I was like, and then it ended up being like really sucky. And have you seen it? So Tom says, he's like, oh, I actually really liked the miniseries. I liked it because I thought it was, closer to the spirit of the book. It was a lot more faithful to the book. He still did agree, though, that Kubrick's version is a million times better. But he's like, I liked it. I liked that that it was closer to the book. So I hadn't seen the series in a very long time, since 1997. And I was like, well, I'm willing to concede that maybe it wasn't as terrible as I remember it being. So late one night, we decided, we got some snacks and we got some booze and shit like that. And we said, we're going to sit here and we're going to watch the whole 6 hours like in one go. So we just like overnight, like one night over 6 hours, we watched the whole thing. Now, I will say straight out that indeed the miniseries was not the atrocity that I had remembered it as. Like I said, maybe I shouldn't have said, because I didn't finish it like back then, because I was like, fuck this, I don't want to watch anymore. But it wasn't as bad as I remembered. Now, that's not to say that it was good. It wasn't good, like, by any means. And parts of it were pretty cringe-inducing. But, at no point during its runtime did I feel like I wanted to scoop out my own eyeballs or, drop kick a baby into a wood chipper or anything like that. It wasn't that terrible. Really, the best that could be said about it was kind of like, it's kind of mediocre, you know what I mean? In that sort of, like, TV movie kind of way. The problem with the entire production, in my opinion, is the same thing that I was alluding to earlier about King not really, I'm sure he understands it, but it's just like it never happens in practice. I feel like he doesn't really know how to maneuver around the differences between the mediums of, book and movie. You know what I'm saying? I will say, like, this version, the 1997 version of The Shining, is way more faithful to the book than Stanley Kubrick's movie, and maybe slavishly faithful, but that to me is the exact reason why it doesn't work and why I didn't like it and why I didn't think it was scary. So the main overarching difference, I think, between the two adaptations is that Stephen King's version was literal and Kubrick's was mythic. And just one example of that, the King written miniseries was filmed in and around the Stanley Hotel, which is actually the hotel that Stephen King was inspired to write The Shining. That's the real hotel that he based it on. While Kubrick's version, obviously the interior of the Overlook was all a set. So that gave it a much more controlled, but also like otherworldly and like sort of dreamlike, and hence a mythical quality. And one of King's main criticisms, I think, of Stanley Kubrick's movie was that, one of many, was that in casting Jack Nicholson, Kubrick sort of like presents a guy who's clearly like a raging loon right from the start. Stephen King, in trying to rectify this, I guess, he cast Steven Weber, who I actually recognize from Wings, that TV show, but he's been in like tons of other things. So he cast him as Jack Torrance. But the thing about it, I don't know. I have to say that, yes, the Jack Nicholson version of Jack Torrance is a significant departure from the novel one, although I don't think it's as significant a departure as maybe people perceive it as. But the thing about Steven Weber, and he's like a good actor, like he's good in other things I've seen him in, but the thing that I didn't like about him in this particular adaptation was that he's more striving to play Jack as a fallen good guy, and I got the sense that there was this sort of like forced joviality. You know what I mean? Like, if you know what I'm saying? So I kind of got that from the character, which I didn't love. Now, the character in the book, even though he wasn't as ragey or anything like that as Jack Nicholson maybe, he was still like a drunk, and he was still abusive, like toward his son, like he had hurt his son at one point. And the thing about it too is that even though Jack Nicholson, yeah, he was a departure from the book character somewhat, but I kind of feel like he was much scarier in the Kubrick version because he just exuded this like anger and desperation because he was like teetering on the brink of insanity, like even from the beginning. And to me, that made it really much scarier because you knew that like you never knew when he was gonna like pop, you know what I mean? So to me, that like added a lot of like tension to the movie, that he was kind of like, it wasn't like ragey from the start, but you could tell he was like on edge, you know what I mean? And to me, that seemed like very effective and like much, much scarier. I think Stephen King's most persistent gripe though, about Kubrick's movie was that he thought it was soulless. Like and I've heard him make this metaphor like a bunch of times, but he's saying, it's almost like the movie, he compares it to like the most beautiful like Rolls Royce or something like that, but then you look and it doesn't have an engine in it. So it's like beautiful but useless or soulless. It doesn't have what's in it that like gives it heart or makes it work or whatever. Basically, so Stephen King is, what I think he's getting at is that, well, the heart of my book was sort of like ripped out and stomped flat in service to Kubrick's sort of like coldly logical exploration of like his pet themes. Now, I can see why King would see it that way, but I don't know. I feel like it's like missing the point a little bit. Yes, I will concede that Kubrick simply used the frame of King's story to hang his own vision on, and along the way may have somewhat altered the original intent of King's novel, though I don't think as much as maybe some people perceived. But the thing about it is I don't really think Kubrick was that much concerned with this sort of sentimental and kind of, honestly like pedestrian tragedy of Jack's downward spiral, into alcoholism and, being taken over by the hotel because of that weakness. I think Kubrick was more interested in creating this sort of archetypal like meditation on evil, on isolation, the fragility of rationality, stuff like that. He wanted to like make, as I said, like a more mythical, more philosophical film, I guess, if you want to put it that way. So you have things like, in direct comparison, you have Stanley Kubrick's film having this elegant hedge maze, which kind of like brings up the stories of Theseus and the Minotaur. And then in King's version, you have the roving hedge animals, which were super cool in the book, but when you see them in the TV series, it looks really ridiculous. They kind of looked like green CGI Scooby-Doos, like running around. Like I said, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. Shit that works in a book. The shit was scary in the book, right? Like the hedge animals, the topiary. That was scary in the book, that they were like creeping closer and shit like that. But when you see it on the screen, it just looks dumb. It just looks silly. Another thing that I really liked about Kubrick's version was that he keeps a lot of aspects of the hotel's history ambiguous. You see the woman in the bathtub. You see the blowjob furry situation. You see all that, but there's no explanation. There's no context. And to me, that makes me like wig out even more, because like, what the fuck is going on with that? And you don't know. You're in the same shoes as the Torrance family, because they don't know what the fuck is going on either. So I really like that. It puts you in their shoes. You see things contextless, much, much scarier. And that's kind of like, so it mirrors the confusion and the sort of dislocation of the characters, much scarier. In the TV series, or the TV version, they kind of like drop this big pallet load of exposition about all the horrible things that happened in the hotel over the years in like the first 10 minutes of the movie. Yes, I know it does that in the book too, but it works in the book. It works in the book because that's how that works. You need exposition. All of these horrible things happen in the hotel. Don't do too much expositing in a horror movie. It's better if shit's not explained. Kubrick's version is scarier because nothing is really explained. You just see the stuff and you don't know what it is or why that's there or what. It's just scary. You know, Stanley Kubrick's film had the creepy sisters. You know, King's version had a hose with CGI teeth, which again was in the book. Scary in the book, not scary in the movie. Another thing too was that, you know, obviously the 1980 Kubrick's version had Danny talking to Tony with his little finger like that, which I love. I actually really love that. And he's like with the croaking voice. To me, that's like very unsettling. In the TV version, if you haven't seen it, Danny sees Tony. He sees him as like this teenager with glasses on who's kind of like floating, you know, in front of him, like telling him about stuff. And I was like, again, I know that's kind of how it was in the book, that he could actually see him. But again, it looks dorky. It looks dumb when you see it in a movie. I really, really liked the sort of elegance, the simplicity of Danny talking like that and like talking in a different voice and not being able to actually see Tony. I thought that was like much, much scarier. And the thing about it too is that in the TV version, and I can't remember if it was like this in the book or not, but in the TV version, you find out that that Tony that he's seeing, that's actually like him grown up, like when he's 18 or something like that, which, you know, neat, but I don't know. I just thought it was weird that like the little kid would be out like, oh, what's going on and stuff, and then he'd see like this teenager with glasses like floating over there by the stop sign or whatever, and I'm just like, that's just really stupid. Kubrick's film also, another thing that he liked, he kind of kept apparitions to a minimum, and like when you did see them, they just looked like regular people. I mean, it looked like Grady, or, you know, when Jack Torrance like goes into the gold room and there's like all of the party goers and they just look like regular people, you know, and the bartender and shit like that, Lloyd, they all just look like regular people. Much, much creepier because you know that they're not really there. So you can kind of like, you know, because that's how Jack Torrance would see them. He perceives them as real people. He doesn't see them as like ghosty kind of shit. You know what I mean? In the TV version, they tried to make it much more like horror-y, I guess. So, you know, you have like all of these ghosts, and they look like ghosts. They kind of appear and disappear in like smoke tendrils. They have really, really bad makeup, even though, you know, it's weird. I think just from a quick search, I think that the 1997 TV version, I think it won a bunch of Emmys, I want to say, or whatever the award would be. And I think makeup was one of them. Like, the makeup in this is so bad, though. Like, even for like 1997, like, I thought the makeup was like really terrible. It's just, I don't know, it just wasn't scary. And then there was one like repeating guy that kept turning up that had like a wolf mask on, and I'm sitting there going, I couldn't like decide. I'm like, is that supposed to look like a real werewolf, or is that supposed to look like a guy in a wolf mask, or what is that? So yeah, so I don't know. I just thought the makeup looked kind of bad, and I think it was much scarier that the ghosts in Kubrick's version just looked like regular people, and they were interacting like regular people. Another thing is that, you know, obviously Kubrick's film ends with Jack freezing to death, and he's just there, and there's that still on his face, and then they go into, you know, the picture, and they go into the close-up of that. It's like he's always been the caretaker, that kind of stuff. Much, much scarier. And the overlook is still there. So it's almost kind of like, oh, evil never dies type thing, to me, which is much more frightening. Whereas in the TV version, which sticks closer to what happened in the book, Jack is like fighting with two ghosts over control of the boiler. Like, he's trying to like turn it, and the ghosts are like, dude, it's bad. It's just like a whole like ridiculous situation. The whole metaphor about letting off steam, you know, boiling over, stuff like that, I'm just kind of like, oh geez, it's just like so obvious. I don't know. And then like he lets the whole hotel blow up with him inside it, which is kind of like a redemption, which, like I said, that's kind of like what happened in the book, but I don't know. I kind of like preferred Kubrick's version was, much more frightening, that the hotel's still there and it won, kind of. You know what I mean? So, I mean, from all those examples, at every turn, as you can see, like, Stephen King, he chose to portray in his version of the film the story pretty much exactly as he had written it. And I think at pretty much every turn, this was a mistake. I think it was just kind of like... So I think it just ended up being this sort of like plotting literalism, whereas Kubrick's movie ended up being like this universal, like philosophical, like mythical piece of art, really. Now, I will say that the only sop to the novel that King made in the TV version that I liked was that Halloran didn't get killed at the end. Because like I said, he doesn't get killed in the book. He gets killed in Kubrick's version. Now, I do understand and agree with the reasons that Kubrick killed Halloran in his version, because I think, and again, made it more frightening, was that even after all this ordeal that Halloran went through to get there, he had his own shining. He was like rushing up there. He had the plane and the snowcat and everything like that, and he's trying to get up there to save Wendy and Danny. And then, like, the minute he walks in the place, he gets fucking axed to death. So to me, made it much more frightening. But I will say that it was still kind of a bummer, because Scatman Crothers, who played Halloran, is a fucking legend, and it always like made me sad that he died. But like I said, the reason that it makes it scarier is because he was such a good character, and you were like, oh shit, you know what I mean? Like the hotel is winning, you know what I mean? So, yay for that. Yay for Halloran not dying in the TV series version. Of course, he was played by a different actor in the 1997 version. He was played by Melvin Van Peebles. Now, I will say that the TV version, it was, the acting was pretty decent for this type of thing. Like I said, Steven Weber was in it. Rebecca De Mornay was in it, like, playing Wendy. It wasn't awful, but it was just, like, nothing to write home about either. It's, like, it's okay in a TV movie sort of way. I didn't really get the sense that these were real people the way I did in Kubrick's version. I mean, say what you want about Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall, because a lot of people bitched about the casting. Not so much anymore, but at the time they did. But I kind of think the casting in that point was, like, it's pretty weird, like, on the surface, I guess, but it sort of, like, worked like gangbusters in the final version, in my opinion. But, I mean, they played those roles with fucking conviction, man. I mean, they seem... And I know the stories about, like, Kubrick, like, abusing poor Shelley Duvall to get that performance out of her. And I don't advocate that, but at least, like, the performance is amazing. Like, all the performances are amazing. I will say, too, that the little kid that played Danny in the TV version... He was kind of like, I didn't really get a sense of him as a real person either. And he had this weird thing with his mouth where he couldn't really, like, close it all the way. And it's like I said, I'm not going to pick on a kid, but, I mean, obviously he's not a kid anymore, but he was a kid at the time, and it seemed like he kind of had a sinus infection or something like that. I don't really know, but it was kind of distracting. And he had, like, his dialogue was, like, kind of stilted, I thought, like, very oddly stilted. And that kind of brings me to another one of the things that I really didn't like about the TV series was that dialogue. Stephen King, like, even in his books, he really is good at writing, like, relatable characters, but he does have this thing where he puts, like, these weird regionalisms and repeated catchphrases, like, into the mouths of his protagonists. I mean, I can forgive this in the novels because it's usually not frequent enough to be all that grating, even though I don't really know anybody that talks like a Stephen King character in real life. Then again, to be fair, I'm not from Maine, so there might very well be people that talk like that. But on the page, it's fine. It's just part of the whole world that he's created, and I buy into it. But when you see it in a movie, when you hear these sort of, like, cute verbal touchstones, like, spoken aloud many, 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 many times, like, over a 6-hour period, it kind of gets on your nerves a little bit. I mean, in this particular TV version, I swear, I mean, I thought I was gonna, like, strain something from eye rolling and wincing in empathetic embarrassment with Steven Weber, as it's like he had to, like, refer to Danny as a pup and tell him he was going to like take his medicine, just like over and over and over and over again. And I was just like, Jesus Christ, will you please stop? It just seemed like he was saying it like every fucking 5 minutes. And I was just like, will you please stop? I was just like cringing. Also, there's this one line, I can't remember exactly what the one line is, but it has something to do with kissing, missing, something like that. And I was just kind of like, and that was another one that was repeated a few times like throughout the thing. And I was just like, please stop. Like, let's don't say that. It's like, I don't know. It was just like making me squirm. It was just like so fucking embarrassing. I mean, I don't know. I just got the sense like some of the catchphrases, it's almost like they were trying to wedge it into the movie like as many times as possible so they could like sell t-shirts with that shit on there. I don't really know what it was, but I was just kind of like, can we not have all this repeated dialogue? It's driving me crazy. And then there was the epilogue. Now, as far as I can remember, because at the end of the book, right, like Halloran lives and there's a little bit of an epilogue, but it's just like shortly after they've escaped, right? I mean, Halloran is like talking to Danny about, you know, about his dad being dead and all this other kind of stuff. And then Wendy is in the hospital, I think, and, you know, recovering from her injuries or whatever. And that's kind of where it ends as far as that's what I remember of it. But in the TV version of the movie, they jump ahead. There's an epilogue and they jump ahead 10 years later. And Wendy and Halloran are watching Danny graduating from high school. And like I said, now Danny looks like the floating Tony. You know what I mean? Like from earlier that Danny was talking to when he was a little kid. So, and then like, so Danny gets his diploma and then he looks out into the crowd, like all the crowd there. And he sees like Ghost Dad. He sees Ghost Jack standing there and he blows him a kiss and says that horrible like kissing missing line again. And I was just kind of like, and then like I cringed again. And I was just kind of like, I don't know. It's just something about it was like really creepy and like really maudlin. And I was just like not into it. I mean, here's the thing. I understand that The Shining, the book, was very personal for Stephen King. You know, he was going through alcoholism and things like that. And, you know, he based it on his own struggles with that. And I can see that when he made the 1997 TV version, after having been sober for so long, he'd want to add that little kind of like hooray for redemption kind of thing. It's like, yeah, you know, Jack was a bad guy and all this, and he tried to kill his family and all this other kind of stuff, but in the end he sacrificed himself. He destroyed the hotel. You know, he sacrificed himself so that his wife and son could get away, and so he solved everything, so he got redeemed. So I understand like why he would want to add that in, you know, almost as like saying, see, you know, the alcohol made us both monsters, but we came through it okay and we're still good guys, you know, even if it's just in the afterlife. So he's like a ghost now and he's like, oh, I got to see my kid graduate and stuff like that. I get that, but I don't know. It's in this movie, like seeing it like that, it seemed a little sappy. It seemed a little self-indulgent. It seemed a little chick flicky. I don't know, not quite, but I don't know. It was just, I feel like it was, but it was kind of something you'd see like at the end of a Lifetime movie, you know what I mean? And I was just kind of like, ew, I don't know. I didn't like it. It was very mawkish, you know, and I don't really like that. In my opinion, the reason that Stanley Kubrick's adaptation is still widely adored, widely talked about, generally considered one of the top 5 best, scariest horror movies ever made, I think that's precisely because he sort of like restrained that emotional impulse and elevated the source material to make an artistic statement that would be sort of like universal. He kind of trusted the audience to fill in their own blanks. Like I said, he didn't really go into the backstory too much. He left a lot of things open to interpretation. And I think when you do that, if you do it well, then people can read their own things into it. I feel like the thing about the book, yes, you could, yeah, maybe it has like different interpretations, but it's very, very clearly, you know, a downward spiral of a guy like dealing with alcoholism and like at a haunted hotel and shit like that. And it doesn't really seem like it wants to be more than that, which is fine. But Stanley Kubrick, I mean, he was an artist, he was an auteur, and he's like, well, I'm going to take that, but I'm going to universalize it. I'm going to make it ambiguous enough that it doesn't have to be about alcoholism. It could be about lots of other things. Everybody can like read their own thing into it. So he took what was a good story about a decent man being sort of tragically consumed by his demons and started adding layers and layers of like subtext and symbolism, and as I said, like universalized the story like far beyond its sort of dysfunctional family roots, and he turned it into this complex, terrifying fable that, you know, can be and has been interpreted in shit tons of different ways. And by the way, right here, I'm gonna recommend, if you haven't seen it, the Shining documentary, Room 237, which is about all of the different theories about what it means, like all the conspiracies around it and stuff like that. Some of them are like way the fuck out there, obviously. Oh, we just Kubrick faked the moon landing. They go into that, but they go into like a bunch of other ones too, and it's actually like really, really fascinating how people love to geek out about this movie. And I'm not judging, because I geek out about this movie too, even though I do think some people's theories are like way what the fuck off the mark. But see, that's the cool thing about art, is that everybody brings their own shit to it. And honestly, I've seen some theories that on their face, like people were like, yeah, we think The Shining means this and that. And I was like, you're high. I'm like, it doesn't mean that. But then like when they kind of lay it out, you're like, oh, maybe, you know what I mean? So the fact that it was the fact that Kubrick made it like that, and that people are still talking about and still coming up with theories about it, like, you know, this many years later, I mean, that's a real testament to the piece of art that he created. And, you know, by contrast, I think the 1997, you know, Stephen King Mick Garris version, they basically just took what was on the page and slapped it on the screen pretty much word for word in like a very ordinary way. And they sort of like, so I kind of feel like they drained the narrative of any vitality or any kind of like visual impact. It doesn't really, it just seems very TV movie-ish. They didn't make like an artistic statement with it, you know, even with the themes or with the visuals like Kubrick did. And another thing about it that I didn't like was that it didn't really leave any room for the viewer. Like, everything was just laid out for you, like, this is what it means. Like, everything was over-explained. To be fair, like, an argument could be made that it is theoretically possible to make a more faithful movie adaptation of King's novel that's still an amazing movie, but this is not it. And I don't think that Stephen King would necessarily be the one, because like I said, he's an amazing writer, but when he's kind of trying to translate his stuff to the screen, I think he wants to keep as much of the book, because, which is understandable, because it's very personal for him, obviously. You know, I'm a writer as well. Your shit's very personal, and you don't like to see it like changed when it goes to another medium. But as I said, stuff that works in his books doesn't work in a movie so much. And I kind of feel like that's why adaptations of his work in general sort of like tend to be all over the map. Like, some of them are great, some of them not so much, some of them are awful. And I think the best ones, I don't know if this is true right across the board, but I feel like the best ones kind of change the most, or, you know, tweak things to be more like conducive to, you know, the film medium, because, you know, the same thing doesn't work in both things. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this long and very rambling discussion about The Shining. I really never get sick of talking about this movie, and I really wanted to kind of compare and contrast the Kubrick version, which is one of my favorite films, with the 1997 version, which I really didn't like, just to maybe like illuminate like why one's good and the other one is not good, at least in my opinion. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.